I remember the exact sound my heart made before it stopped, a wet, erratic thud, drowned out by the popping of champagne corks in the next room. I lay dying on the cold linoleum of the biogenetics lab, coughing up blood while the people I trusted most celebrated stealing my life's work. Clara's cold eyes staring down at me, Anthony's mocking toast echoing through the glass. They took my patent, my dignity, and finally my life. But the universe has a wicked sense of irony. When I opened my eyes again, the champagne was gone, my lungs were clear, and the calendar on my phone read exactly 1 year earlier. They thought they had won. They didn't realize I had just been given a second chance to watch them burn. The sterile ozone-scented air of the Biogenetics Innovations Laboratory is something that burrows into your pores and never truly leaves. In my previous life, I thought it was the smell of progress. I thought the relentless hum of the ultra-centrifuges and the blue glow of the hydroponic incubators were the backdrop to my legacy. I was Jonathan Miller, the lead botanical geneticist. For 5 years, I had poured every waking hour, every ounce of my sanity, into Project Aegis, a genetically modified strain of wheat designed to grow in hyper-arid conditions, completely resistant to the devastating blights wiping out crops in the global south. It was a miracle seed. It was supposed to save millions from starvation. Instead, it killed me. The memory of my death is etched into my consciousness like a permanent scar. We had just achieved a 99% germination rate in the simulated desert biomes. I had been awake for 72 hours, fueled by espresso and sheer adrenaline. Clara Jenkins, my lead research partner and the woman I had stupidly asked to marry me 6 months prior, walked into my private sterile bay. She handed me a thermos of black coffee. I remember her smile, it didn't reach her eyes. "Drink up, John," she had said softly. "Anthony wants the final IP transfer document signed before the board meeting at noon." I took a long gulp. It tasted metallic, slightly bitter, like burnt almonds. 10 minutes later, my vision blurred. 20 minutes later, my chest seized with a pain so violent it felt like a heavy iron spike had been driven through my sternum. I collapsed, shattering a rack of test tubes. As I lay there, paralyzing cold creeping up my limbs, the door opened again. Anthony Beaumont, the CEO of Biogenetics and the man I saw as a mentor, stepped over my twitching body. He didn't call an ambulance. He just picked up my encrypted hard drive, looked at Clara, and nodded. "Shame about the sudden cardiac arrest," Anthony had murmured, his polished leather shoes squeaking on the linoleum next to my face. "The stress of the job, I suppose. But his work will live on, under my name." Then darkness. A suffocating, infinite void, until I woke up gasping, thrashing against tangled, sweat-soaked bedsheets. I bolted upright, my hands clutching my chest, expecting to feel the phantom spike of the heart attack. There was nothing, just the frantic, healthy thumping of a 30-year-old heart. I looked around wildly. I wasn't in the lab. I wasn't in a morgue. I was in my cramped, overpriced Boston apartment. The morning sunlight was fighting its way through the cheap blinds. The smell of stale takeout lingered in the air. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. The blinding screen displayed the date. Tuesday, October 12th. Not just any October 12th. I checked the year. It was exactly 1 year before the day I died. I stumbled into the bathroom and braced myself against the sink, staring into the mirror. The face looking back at me was younger, less hollowed out by the final, brutal year of Project Aegis. The dark circles under my eyes were manageable. I splashed freezing water on my face, gasping at the shock of it. It wasn't a dream. The memory of the poison burning my throat was too vivid, the smug look on Anthony's face too real. I had been reborn, or sent back. The mechanics didn't matter. What mattered was the timeline. October 12th. Today was the day Anthony had scheduled the preliminary alignment meeting. In my past life, this was the day I naively handed over my initial breakthrough algorithms, the core genetic sequencing that made the Aegis strain viable to the company's central servers, believing Anthony's lie that it was just for data backup. Once it was on their servers, they owned the foundational mechanics. They legally trapped me. A slow, dark smile stretched across my face in the mirror. It was a smile I didn't recognize, cold and entirely devoid of the naive scientist who just wanted to feed the world. "They want the data," I whispered to my reflection. "Let them have it." But I knew something they didn't. The sequence I had finalized on October 11th, the one currently sitting on my secure laptop, had a latent, devastating flaw. It was highly susceptible to a mutated variant of rust fungus, a weakness I wouldn't discover for another 4 months. In my past life, I had quietly patched the flaw, rewriting the genome late at night without telling the board, saving the project. This time, I wouldn't patch it. I would leave the ticking time bomb exactly where it was. I walked into the gleaming glass and steel lobby of Biogenetics Innovations at 8:45 a.m. The familiar environment, which had once felt like a second home, now felt like a slaughterhouse. I swiped my keycard, the electronic chime sounding like a death knell, and took the elevator to the 40th floor. My desk was just as I remembered it, cluttered with peer-reviewed journals, empty coffee cups, and a framed photo of Clara and me at a botanical garden. I picked up the photo, slid it out of the frame, and dropped it into the trash can without a second thought. At 9 a.m. sharp, the intercom buzzed. "John, Anthony is ready for you in the executive suite. Bring the drive." Clara's voice, crisp, professional, and entirely hollow. I grabbed my encrypted flash drive and took the long walk down the corridor. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the executive suite, Anthony was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, practically purring with anticipation. Clara stood beside him, holding a tablet, looking like the perfect, loyal assistant, or, as I now knew, his co-conspirator. "Ah, Jonathan, my boy," Anthony boomed, spreading his arms. "The man of the hour. Have a seat. Clara tells me you've finalized the base sequence for Aegis. Truly groundbreaking stuff. The board is ecstatic." I remained standing. "I have the sequence, Anthony." "Excellent," he said, tapping a polished fingernail against his desk. "If you just plug it in and transfer it to the main server, legal has some standard preliminary IP waivers for you to sign. Just formalities, you know. Making sure the company's investment is protected." In my previous life, I had signed without reading, eager to get back to the lab. Today, I looked down at the documents. They were predatory. They stripped me of all naming rights, patent royalties, and even restricted my ability to work in agritech for a decade if I left the company. I tossed the flash drive onto his desk. It clattered against his Mont Blanc pen. "The sequence is on there," I said, my voice dangerously calm, unencrypted. "It's all yours, Anthony." Anthony blinked, surprised by how easy it was. He plugged it into his terminal, his eyes scanning the files. Clara leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening as she recognized the complexity of the data. This is brilliant, John," Clara breathed, turning to me. For a second, I almost saw genuine admiration in her eyes. It made my stomach turn. "Now about those signatures," Anthony prompted, sliding the paperwork toward me. I picked up the pen he offered. I looked at it, then looked at him. I applied pressure with my thumbs until the expensive plastic snapped in half, ink splattering across the pristine white contract. Anthony jumped back, his chair rolling against the glass wall. "What the hell is wrong with you, Miller?" "I'm not signing, Anthony. In fact, I'm done." Clara frowned, stepping forward. "John, what are you talking about? Done? We are on the verge of the biggest agricultural breakthrough of the century. You can't just throw a tantrum." "It's not a tantrum, Clara," I said, locking eyes with her until she nervously looked away. "It's a resignation, effective immediately." Anthony scoffed, recovering his composure. He wiped the ink off his desk with a handkerchief. "You think you can just walk away? You have a contract, and more importantly, I already have the data. He tapped the flash drive. "We don't need you to finish this, Jonathan. You're brilliant, but you're just a mechanic. Clara and the rest of the team can take this across the finish line. You walk out that door, you get nothing. You'll be blacklisted in every major lab in the country." "I don't intend to work in another lab," I replied, turning my back on them. "Then what are you going to do?" Clara demanded, her voice rising in frustration. "You're a geneticist, John. You belong in a sterile room, not out in the world." I paused at the door, looking over my shoulder. "I'm going farming." "Good luck with Project Aegis, Anthony. You're going to need it." I walked out of the building with nothing but a small cardboard box of personal items. My phone was already buzzing relentlessly. HR, Anthony, Clara. I took out the SIM card, snapped it in half, and tossed it into a storm drain. They had the flawed data. They thought they had the keys to the kingdom. But agritech isn't software. You can't just launch an update when there's a bug. You have to plant it in the earth. You have to wait. And when the flaw in that sequence finally manifested, it wouldn't just be a glitch. It would be an ecological and financial catastrophe. And I was going to be far away, building the real future, when the sky fell on their heads. 2 days later, the Boston skyline was a distant memory, replaced by the rolling, untamed hills of northern Vermont. The tires of my beat-up truck crunched over the overgrown gravel driveway of Oakhaven, the 100-acre farm my grandfather had left me. In my previous life, I had viewed Oakhaven as a burden. I paid property taxes on it but let it rot, too obsessed with my sterile lab environments to care about real, muddy soil. The farmhouse was sagging, the paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The main barn leaned precariously to the left, and the fields were choked with aggressive weeds and thorny brush. To anyone else, it was a wasteland. To me, it was a sanctuary. I spent the first week doing nothing but brutal, back-breaking labor. I ripped out the rotting floorboards of the farmhouse, patched the roof with cheap tin, and cleared out the smaller, structurally sound greenhouse behind the barn. My hands, once soft and scrubbed raw by chemical disinfectants, quickly became calloused and blistered. Every night, my muscles screamed in agony, but I slept deeper and more peacefully than I had in years. There were no nightmares of Clara's cold smile, just the quiet hum of the crickets. I wasn't entirely cut off from the world. I had bought a cheap burner phone and a satellite internet dish. Every evening, I'd boot up a burner laptop and check the news. It didn't take long for Anthony to make his move. 3 weeks after my resignation, the headline broke on Forbes and Wired. Biogenetics Innovations announces Project Aegis, the end of global famine. I watched the live-streamed press conference from the dusty porch of my farmhouse, a mug of black coffee in hand. Anthony stood at the podium, looking regal in a tailored suit, projecting absolute confidence. Clara stood right behind him, introduced as the lead visionary biologist. "For too long, humanity has been at the mercy of the climate," Anthony announced to the flash of cameras. "Today, biogenetics shifts that paradigm. The Aegis seed is a marvel of modern genetics. It yields 300% more crop in arid conditions, requires a fraction of the water, and is immune to all known regional blights." A reporter from the front row raised her hand. "Mr. Beaumont, rumors circulating in the industry suggest the original architect of this project, Jonathan Miller, abruptly left the company. Can you comment on how his departure affects the timeline?" Anthony offered a practiced, sympathetic smile. "Jonathan is a talented technician, and we wish him the best. Unfortunately, the pressure of a project this magnitude is not for everyone. He suffered a personal breakdown and chose to pursue a quieter life. But rest assured, science is a team effort. Dr. Jenkins and our elite team have already finalized the stabilization phase. We are moving to mass field testing next month." I chuckled, taking a sip of my coffee. Stabilization phase. They were rushing it. The corporate greed was blinding them to basic scientific rigor. They were taking the flawed sequence, running a few fast-tracked computer simulations, and heading straight to the dirt. They were taking millions in advance investments based on a lie they didn't even know they were telling. I closed the laptop and walked out to the greenhouse. Inside, the environment was highly controlled, but not with multi-million-dollar equipment. I had rigged a climate control system using salvaged industrial fans, cheap humidifiers, and an Arduino board. Under the glowing purple light of LED grow lamps, rows of small, dark soil plots sat in silence. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, airtight vial. Inside were 50 seeds. These weren't the Aegis seeds. These were the true Aegis, the fixed, perfected sequence that I had engineered in my mind during my past life and hastily synthesized in a private university lab I rented under a fake name before driving up to Vermont. Biogenetics had the beta version, doomed to fail catastrophically when exposed to high acidity soil and specific humidity conditions they would inevitably face during mass field testing. I had the master key. I carefully planted the first seed into the rich, dark earth. "Grow," I whispered to the dirt. Over the next few months, winter descended on Vermont. Snow buried Oakhaven under 3 feet of white powder, but inside my greenhouse, life was thriving. My plants grew at an astonishing rate. Their stalks were thicker, their leaves a vibrant, aggressive green. I intentionally infected one batch with the deadly rust fungus that I knew would inevitably wipe out biogenetics crops. My plants absorbed the fungus, broke it down, and used it as a secondary nitrogen source. It was beautiful. Meanwhile, Derek Voss, the ruthless VP of operations at Biogenetics, was spearheading the massive land acquisitions for their field tests. Through my quiet monitoring of industry forums, I saw Derek buying up thousands of acres of cheap, highly acidic land in Texas and Arizona. They wanted to prove the seeds worked in the harshest conditions to secure a multi-billion-dollar government contract. They were digging their own graves, and Derek was driving the backhoe. One evening in late February, there was a knock on my farmhouse door. It startled me. I hadn't had a visitor in 4 months. I grabbed a heavy iron wrench from the counter before answering. Standing on the porch was Sarah, the owner of the massive dairy farm 3 miles down the road. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, wearing a heavy Carhartt jacket. She looked at the wrench in my hand, raising an eyebrow. "Expecting trouble, farm boy?" she asked, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "Just a habit. Can I help you, Sarah?" "Maybe I can help you," she said, nodding toward my barn. "Word in town is you're some hotshot city scientist playing in the dirt. But your tractor's been dead in the field for a week, and the spring thaw is coming. You want to actually plant whatever secret you're hiding in that greenhouse, you'll need my heavy machinery." I hesitated. I needed to scale up my operation to a full acre to prove the commercial viability of my seeds before Biogenetics' inevitable collapse. I couldn't do it by hand. "What's your price?" I asked. Sarah smiled, a genuine sharp look. "You're hiding out here for a reason, John. I recognize the look of a man plotting something. I don't care what it is. But the corporate farms are squeezing us locals dry. If whatever you're growing can give the little guy an edge, I want in on the ground floor." I looked at Sarah, then out toward the snow-covered fields of Oakhaven. The game was expanding. It was time to start building my own empire from the ashes of the one they were about to burn down. "Come inside," I said, opening the door wider. "Let me tell you about a little company called Biogenetics." Spring broke over the Vermont hills with a violent, muddy intensity. The frozen earth surrendered to the thaw, turning Oakhaven into a sprawling canvas of wet, dark soil. Sarah, true to her word, arrived on the first clear morning in April driving a massive, rumbling diesel tractor. She didn't ask questions about the blueprints I had hastily sketched on the back of diner napkins. She just dropped the plow and started tearing up the 3 acres behind my dilapidated barn. "Soil's acidic," Sarah shouted over the roar of the engine, wiping a streak of grease from her forehead. "Whatever magic beans you're planting, city boy, they better have an iron stomach. We've got a high concentration of iron and aluminum toxicity in this lower basin." "That is exactly what I am counting on," I yelled back, a fierce, genuine grin breaking across my face. The labor was agonizing. For 14 hours a day, I was on my knees in the dirt, transplanting the fragile, vibrant green seedlings from my greenhouse into the unforgiving Vermont earth. My muscles burned, and my fingernails were permanently stained black. But every time I looked at those resilient little stalks, I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated power. This was the true Aegis. It wasn't just surviving the acidic soil, it was aggressively metabolizing it, turning the harsh environment into fuel. But a farm is an isolated place, and revolutions require intelligence from the front lines. That intelligence arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening, driving a battered silver Honda Civic that sputtered and died right in front of my porch. I stepped out, a heavy canvas tarp draped over my shoulders to block the downpour. A woman climbed out of the dying car, cursing under her breath. She looked to be in her late 20s, wearing a soaking wet trench coat, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks. She dragged a heavy, waterproof Pelican case from the back seat and marched up my wooden steps, completely ignoring my intimidating posture. "Jonathan Miller?" she asked, her voice shaking from the cold, but her eyes burning with an intense, furious light. "Depends on who is asking," I replied, not stepping aside. "My name is Victoria Trent," she said, shivering as she shoved a laminated ID badge into my chest. "Former lead pathologist for biogenetics, Clara fired me yesterday. Security gave me 10 minutes to clear my desk. They said I was being disruptive to the company vision." I looked at the badge, then back at her. "And what exactly was your disruption, Victoria?" "I ran a secondary pathogenic model on the Aegis beta strain," she spat out, her jaw clenching. "The simulation models Anthony is showing the board are cherry-picked. They only tested for standard drought and heat resistance. When I introduced the parameters of the Texas testing sites, specifically the hyper-arid alkaline dust mixed with native fungal spores, the entire crop model failed. It didn't just fail, it suffered a catastrophic genetic collapse within 72 hours. A cold thrill shot down my spine. The flaw. She had found the dormant rust fungus susceptibility that I had left in the code. Clara, in her desperate bid for glory, had silenced the only person trying to save them. "And when you told Clara?" I asked softly. Victoria let out a bitter, hollow laugh. She told me I was overcomplicating the narrative. She said the IPO was happening in August, the government contracts were already in escrow, and that I was jealous of her success. Then she fired me, but I didn't leave empty-handed. She tapped the heavy black case at her feet. "I downloaded the real-time telemetry from their Texas fields. I know you didn't leave because of a breakdown, Jonathan. I looked at the original sequencing logs. You knew. You left a trap." I stared at her for a long moment. Here she was, brilliant, discarded, and burning with the same righteous fury that kept me awake at night. She was an outcast, just like me, tossed aside by arrogant people who thought they were invincible. The rain hammered against the tin roof of the porch, wrapping us in a curtain of white noise. "Come inside, Victoria," I finally said, pulling the door open. "Let's get you dried off. We have a lot of work to do." Over the next few weeks, Victoria and I became inseparable. The farmhouse, once a lonely sanctuary, became a bustling war room. By day, we worked shoulder to shoulder in the dirt, monitoring the growth of the true Aegis. By night, we huddled around the glow of her stolen monitors, watching the impending doom of biogenetics unfold in real time. Working with her was electric. We spoke the same language of genomes and cellular decay, finishing each other's sentences in a rapid-fire cadence of scientific theory. But it was more than just professional synergy. It was the shared trauma of betrayal. Late one night, as we sat on the porch sharing a bottle of cheap bourbon, she leaned her head against my shoulder. "They made me feel like I was crazy, John," she whispered, her usual fiery demeanor softening into something vulnerable. "Anthony looked right at me and said I lacked the vision for the future. I gave them 3 years of my life." I wrapped an arm around her. the warmth of her presence a stark contrast to the cold, sterile memories of Clara. They don't have vision, Victoria. They have greed. It blinds them to the rot growing right under their feet. But we are going to watch it consume them. Together. She looked up at me, her dark eyes reflecting the faint light from the farmhouse window. The tension that had been building between us for weeks finally snapped. When I kissed her, it wasn't the polite, calculated affection I had shared with Clara. It was raw, desperate, and filled with the promise of a shared future built on the ruins of our enemies. We were the underdogs, covered in mud and dismissed by the giants of the industry. But we held the absolute cure to a starvation crisis those giants were about to trigger. By late June, the Texas heat was merciless, baking the earth into a cracked, desolate landscape. It was the perfect stage for Anthony Beaumont's grand illusion. Biogenetics had planted 10,000 acres of their flawed Aegis seed across a massive, highly alkaline basin outside of Amarillo. Derek Voss had brokered the deal, purchasing the useless land for pennies and leveraging it to secure a massive agricultural subsidy from the state. To the untrained eye, it looked like a miracle. The corporate drones had erected massive billboards bordering the highway, displaying rendering of lush golden wheat fields, standing defiant against the desert sun. Through Victoria's backdoor access to their drone telemetry, we watched the disaster begin. It didn't start with a bang, it started with a whisper, a faint, reddish-brown discoloration on the leaves in Sector 4. To a casual observer, it was just a bit of dust. But to Victoria and me, sitting in the humid Vermont farmhouse, staring at the high-definition feeds, it was the genetic equivalent of a siren. "There it is," Victoria breathed, her fingers flying across the keyboard to isolate the thermal imaging, the mutated rust fungus. The alkaline soil is breaking down the plant's external cell walls, making them a perfect host for the native spores. The flaw is triggering. I leaned closer to the screen, watching the reddish-brown spots multiply by the hour. How long until Clara notices? With their automated monitoring? Maybe 2 days. By then, the root systems will be entirely compromised. 2,000 miles away, in the gleaming glass towers of biogenetics, the panic was a slow, agonizing poison. We pieced together the chaos through intercepted emails and panicked supply chain orders. Clara was the first to realize the magnitude of the horror. According to the data logs Victoria intercepted, Clara had initially ordered a targeted fungicidal spray for Sector 4, classifying it as a minor environmental anomaly. But the spray did nothing. It couldn't do anything. The weakness wasn't environmental. It was baked into the very DNA she had stolen from me. Within a week, Sector 4 was entirely dead, the stalks turning into brittle black ash that crumbled in the wind. And the rust was spreading. It moved like a plague, jumping to Sectors 5, 6, and 7 with terrifying speed. We hacked into the internal security cameras of the Biogenetics Executive Suite. The feed was silent, but the body language screamed louder than words. We watched Clara pacing frantically in Anthony's office, her immaculate appearance disintegrating. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale and drawn. She was waving a thick stack of pathology reports, pointing violently at the numbers. Anthony sat behind his desk, his face a mask of furious denial. He slammed his fists onto the mahogany surface, standing up to tower over her. We didn't need audio to know what he was saying. Fix it. Hide it. The IPO is in 4 weeks. He's not going to halt the project, Victoria said, shaking her head in disbelief as we watched the silent argument. He's too deep. If he admits the Aegis strain is defective, the SEC will investigate him for defrauding investors, and the government will demand their subsidies back. He's going to double down. He's going to try and harvest early, I predicted, a cold knot forming in my stomach. He'll try to reap whatever hasn't rotted yet, grind it up, and mix it with commercial grain to hide the yield deficit. I was right. 3 days later, massive industrial combine harvesters rolled into the Texas fields, ordered to cut down the crop a full month before maturity, but the rust fungus was faster. As the blades sliced through the stalks, millions of microscopic infected spores were kicked up into the dry, howling Texas wind. The dust cloud was massive, a reddish-brown stain against the sky. And then, the real nightmare began. The wind carried the mutated spores beyond the borders of biogenetics property. It swept over the neighboring commercial farms that grew standard, non-modified wheat and corn. The mutated rust, aggressively adapted to destroy the Aegis strain, found the standard crops completely defenseless. "John," Victoria whispered, her face pale as she watched the satellite weather patterns. "It's spreading to the adjacent counties. It's highly contagious." My breath caught in my throat. I had wanted to destroy Anthony and Clara. I had wanted to watch their stolen empire crumble. But the collateral damage was escalating beyond the simulation. The hubris of biogenetics had unleashed an agricultural plague. My phone buzzed on the wooden table. It was a local Vermont number. I picked it up. "John, it's Sarah." Her voice was uncharacteristically tight, devoid of its usual rugged humor. "You need to turn on the news, the national broadcast. Right now." I grabbed the remote and flicked on the small, dusty television in the corner of the room. The breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen in aggressive red letters: "Agricultural state of emergency declared in Texas." The screen showed footage of massive, apocalyptic dust storms rolling across the panhandle. Farmers were standing in fields of black, rotting sludge, crying openly into the cameras. The anchor's voice was grim. "An unprecedented fungal blight has decimated over 40,000 acres of farmland in the last 48 hours. Experts are calling it the fastest-moving agricultural crisis in modern history." The epicenter appears to be the testing grounds of biogenetics innovations, whose highly anticipated Aegis's crop was supposed to be immune to such events. Shares in the company have plummeted by 60% in after-hours trading. I muted the television. The silence in the farmhouse was deafening. I turned to look out the window. Beyond the glass, under the clear Vermont moonlight, my 3 acres of the true Aegis stood tall, thick, and vibrantly healthy. They were an island of absolute perfection in a world that was rapidly burning to the ground. Victoria walked over and stood beside me, sliding her hand into mine. Her grip was tight, grounding me. "They played God," she said softly, "and they created a monster." "Yes," I replied, my voice steady, the initial shock replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. "But we have the cure. We are the only ones holding a seed that can survive what they just unleashed." The phone rang again. This time it wasn't a local number. The caller ID flashed a Washington, D.C. area code. The government, panicked and desperate, was looking for answers, and somebody had finally connected the dots back to the original architect of Project Aegis. I looked at Victoria. She nodded, her eyes fierce. I picked up the phone. "This is Jonathan Miller." "Mr. Miller," a frantic, authoritative voice barked on the other end. "This is the Department of Agriculture. We have a situation, and your former employer is refusing to hand over the unredacted base code for the Aegis project. We need your help. Millions of lives are on the line." A slow, dark smile crossed my face. The karma had come full circle. The people who threw me away to die on a cold linoleum floor were now begging me to save them from their own greed. "I can't help you with biogenetics code," I said smoothly, leaning against the window frame. "Their code is garbage. It's lethal. But if you want to save the American food supply, you need to send a transport plane to Oak Haven Farm in Vermont, because I have something much, much better." Black government-issue SUVs tore through the muddy gravel of Oak Haven's driveway just before dawn. The flashing red and blue lights painted the peeling white paint of my farmhouse in chaotic, urgent strokes. Through the frost-kissed window, Victoria and I watched a dozen armed federal agents step out, their boots sinking deep into the Vermont mud. Behind them, Stepping out of the lead vehicle with a heavy wool overcoat and a grim expression was a man I instantly recognized from the frantic news broadcasts, a senior liaison reporting directly to United States Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack. The government had finally realized that the corporate billionaires didn't have the answers. They needed the outcast. I opened the front door before they could knock, a steaming mug of black coffee in my hand. Victoria stood right behind me, her arms crossed, her posture radiating absolute defiance. The lead agent flashed a gold badge, his eyes darting toward the glowing, humid structure of our greenhouse in the back. "Mr. Jonathan Miller," the agent said, his voice clipped and breathless. "I am Special Agent Tanner, USDA Office of the Inspector General. We have an executive order to requisition any and all viable agricultural assets on this property to combat the ongoing crisis in Texas. A military transport is waiting at Burlington International. You are coming with us." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter warmth ground me. In my past life, a badge and a federal mandate would have terrified me into absolute compliance. I would have handed over my life's work for a pat on the back. But the man who died on that linoleum floor was gone. "Agent Tanner," I replied, my voice dangerously calm, ringing out in the crisp morning air. "You are standing on private property, and if your men take one step toward that greenhouse, I will trigger the incendiary charges wired to the primary incubation bays. The only viable seeds on the planet will be ash before you can draw your weapon." Tanner froze, his hand instinctively dropping toward his holster. The surrounding agents tensed. "John, are you out of your mind?" Tanner barked, staring at me as if I were a terrorist. "There is a massive famine trigger occurring right now. Biogenetics has compromised the entire southern agricultural belt." "Biogenetics is a symptom of a diseased system," I countered, stepping out onto the porch. "Anthony Beaumont stole an incomplete volatile genome and weaponized it for an IPO. You want my help? You want the true Aegis code? Then we do this on my terms." Tanner's jaw clenched. "What are your terms?" "I want a secure, closed-door hearing at the Department of Agriculture headquarters in Washington. Today," I demanded, locking eyes with him. "I want Secretary Vilsack in the room. I want the DOJ Anti-Fraud Division present. And most importantly, I want Anthony Beaumont and Clara Jenkins sitting at that table, believing they are there to beg for a bailout. They need to be in the room when I take their empire apart piece by piece." Tanner hesitated, a bead of cold sweat running down his temple despite the freezing weather. He looked at Victoria, then back at me. Finally, he pulled a satellite phone from his coat and stepped away. 10 minutes of hushed, furious arguing later, he walked back to the porch. "Pack a bag, Miller," Tanner said grimly. "The secretary is waiting." 4 hours later, Victoria and I were walking down the sterile, marble-floored corridors of the USDA headquarters in Washington, D.C. My boots, still caked with a faint rim of Vermont mud, squeaked against the polished stone, a stark contrast to the tailored suits rushing past us in a state of bureaucratic panic. I held a heavily encrypted, titanium-cased hard drive in my left hand. It felt heavier than a bomb. Agent Tanner pushed open the heavy oak doors of Conference Room A. The tension inside the room was thick enough to choke on. At the head of the massive mahogany table sat the Secretary of Agriculture, looking exhausted and furious. Flanking him were stern-faced attorneys from the Department of Justice. But my eyes immediately locked onto the far end of the table. Anthony Beaumont looked like a ghost of his former arrogant self. His bespoke suit hung loosely on his frame, his tie was loosened, and his eyes were bloodshot from days of sleepless panic. Beside him sat Clara. Her pristine, calculated demeanor had completely shattered. She was gnawing on her thumbnail, her perfectly manicured nails chipped and ruined. They hadn't noticed me yet. Anthony was too busy pleading his case to the secretary. "Mr. Secretary, you must understand, this is a minor stabilization error," Anthony lied smoothly, though his voice trembled. If the federal government can inject a $2 billion subsidy to fund an aggressive chemical defoliation protocol, biogenetics can isolate the rust fungus and— The rust fungus is already systemic, Anthony, I said loudly, letting the heavy oak doors slam shut behind me. The entire room went dead silent. Anthony snapped his head up, his mouth falling open. All the blood drained from his face as if he had just seen a dead man walking. Clara gasped, dropping her pen. It clattered loudly onto the polished wood. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and disbelief. "Jonathan?" Clara whispered, her voice cracking. What are you doing here?" I walked slowly to the front of the room, Victoria matching my pace, her chin held high. I placed the titanium hard drive onto the table with a loud, satisfying thud. "I'm here to stop the bleeding," I said, looking directly at Anthony. "Because you are out of your depth, Beaumont. You always were." "Mr. Miller," Secretary Vilsack interrupted, his tone commanding but lined with desperation. "Agent Tanner briefed me on your claims. You say you have the uncorrupted base code for the Aegis project. Biogenetics claims you had a mental breakdown and abandoned your post. I need the truth, and I need it right now. Millions of acres are rotting as we speak." Anthony scrambled to his feet, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He's a disgruntled ex-employee, a saboteur. He intentionally left a flaw in the code to destroy this company. Arrest him." Victoria let out a sharp, cold laugh that echoed off the marble walls. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of printed transcripts and thermal imaging logs, tossing them onto the center of the table. "My name is Victoria Trent, former lead pathologist for biogenetics," she announced, her voice cutting through Anthony's hysteria like a scalpel. "And those documents are the internal, unredacted communications between Anthony Beaumont and Clara Jenkins. They prove that biogenetics was fully aware of the rust susceptibility 6 weeks before the field tests began." Clara shrank back into her chair, covering her mouth with her hands. "I ran the simulations," Victoria continued, looking directly at the DOJ attorneys. "I warned Dr. Jenkins that the crop would suffer a catastrophic genetic collapse. Instead of halting the project, she fired me, locked me out of the servers, and ordered a cover-up to protect their upcoming IPO. They defrauded the United States government, and they poisoned the Texas basin for profit." The silence that followed was suffocating. The Secretary of Agriculture slowly picked up the first page of the emails. His eyes scanned the text, his face darkening with absolute rage. "Anthony," Clara whimpered, looking at the man who had promised her the world. Anthony didn't look at her. He was staring at me, a cornered, rabid animal realizing the trap had snapped shut. "You didn't just steal my life's work, Anthony," I said softly, leaning over the table until my face was inches from his. "You didn't even understand it. You took a rough draft and planted it in the dirt because your greed was louder than your logic. You thought you could just replace me. You thought I was just a mechanic." I straightened up and looked at the secretary. "The beta strain is dead. You cannot save it with chemicals, but the drive on this table contains the true Aegis genome. It metabolizes the rust fungus and uses it for accelerated growth. I have 3 acres currently thriving in hyperacidic soil in Vermont to prove it. I will hand over the patents to the federal government today for 0 royalties under one condition." The secretary looked up from the damning emails. "Name it." "Biogenetics Innovations is liquidated immediately," I demanded, my voice ringing with finality. "All of their laboratory assets, their testing facilities, and their existing cleanroom infrastructure are transferred to a new trust managed by myself and Victoria Trent, and these two," I pointed at Clara and Anthony, "are handed over to the Department of Justice for criminal fraud and ecological terrorism." The fallout was swifter and more brutal than I could have ever calculated. Within 24 hours of that closed-door meeting, biogenetic stock cratered to fractions of a penny. The trading floor screens flashed blinding red as institutional investors violently purged the company from their portfolios. It was a financial bloodbath, a spectacular monument to corporate hubris burning down in real time. Federal marshals raided the glass and steel towers of biogenetics the very next morning. I watched the live news coverage from the plush, secure suite the government had provided us in D.C. Derek Voss, the ruthless VP of operations who bought the tainted land, was dragged out of the lobby in handcuffs, screaming at the cameras. Then came Clara. She didn't have her usual polished veneer. Her makeup was smeared, and she was crying hysterically as a female marshal guided her into the back of an armored transport van. In a desperate bid to save herself, she had offered to testify against Anthony, completely unaware that Anthony had already thrown her under the bus the night before, claiming the scientific failure was entirely her jurisdiction. They were two vipers, locked in a cage, swallowing each other whole. Hard karma had finally come to collect. The DOJ hit Anthony with 72 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the federal government, and reckless endangerment. His assets were frozen. His luxury penthouses were seized. The man who had stood over my dying body in another timeline, mocking my sudden cardiac arrest, was now facing the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary. The universe had balanced the scales. But destroying my enemies was only half the mission. The other half was saving the soil. With the full backing of the United States Military Logistics Network, Victoria and I mobilized the True Aegis. We didn't sleep for a week. We repurposed the seized biogenetics laboratories, converting their massive hydroponic bays into emergency synthesis hubs. We took the pure seeds from my Vermont greenhouse and multiplied them exponentially using rapid cloning agronomy. By late August, cargo planes filled with the new seeds were touching down in Texas. We oversaw the operation from a mobile command center at the edge of the devastated Amarillo Basin. The landscape looked like a war zone. Black, rotting sludge stretched for miles, a graveyard of Anthony's greed. But as the fleets of government-contracted tractors, many of them driven by local farmers like Sarah, who had flown down to lead the mechanized division, began to drill the True Aegis seeds into the poisoned earth, the atmosphere shifted. We waited. The world held its breath. 2 weeks later, the miracle sprouted. I stood on the hood of a dusty Jeep, staring out across the horizon. Beside me, Victoria held a pair of military-grade binoculars, her breath catching in her throat. Breaking through the crust of the black, ruined earth were millions of vibrant, aggressive green shoots. They weren't just surviving the residual rust fungus. They were consuming it. The leaves were thick, the stalks resilient against the punishing Texas wind. "We did it," Victoria whispered, lowering the binoculars. Tears of profound relief and exhaustion pooled in her dark eyes. "John, look at it. It's actually working. The cellular regeneration rate is off the charts." I hopped down from the hood and turned to her. The harsh desert sun cast a golden glow over her face. She was no longer the discarded, furious pathologist who showed up on my porch in the pouring rain. She was the co-architect of a new era. She was my partner, in every sense of the word. I reached out, gently wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. My thumb lingered on her skin. "We didn't just fix their mistake, Victoria. We made something entirely new, something untouchable." She leaned into my touch, her eyes searching mine. The trauma, the betrayal, the endless nights of paranoid labor, it all dissolved in the sweltering heat of the renewed fields. When she pulled me in by the collar of my jacket and kissed me, it tasted like dirt, sweat, and absolute, undeniable victory. It was the taste of a future we had carved out with our own bare hands. 6 months later, the world had fundamentally changed. The famine crisis was entirely averted. The True Aegis yield was so massive that grain surpluses hit a 10-year high. Genesis Agritech, the new company Victoria and I built from the ashes of biogenetics, became the gold standard for ethical, open-source agricultural science. We didn't hoard the code. We licensed it for free to developing nations, ensuring that no corporation could ever hold a monopoly on starvation again. I returned to Oak Haven Farm just as the first snows of winter began to blanket the Vermont hills. The dilapidated barn was gone, replaced by a state-of-the-art research facility entirely powered by geothermal energy. But the old farmhouse remained exactly the same. I sat on the porch, a heavy blanket draped over my legs, a mug of hot coffee warming my calloused hands. Inside, I could hear Victoria arguing passionately on a conference call with international delegates, her brilliant mind already solving the next global challenge. I looked out at the frozen fields, my heart beating in a steady, powerful rhythm inside my chest. I had died a naive mechanic, poisoned by the people I loved. I was reborn as a force of nature, an architect who turned the very dirt against those who tried to bury me. They thought they could profit off the collapse of the world. They thought I was just collateral damage. But as I took a slow sip of my coffee, listening to the quiet, peaceful hum of the winter wind, I knew the absolute truth. When you try to bury a farmer, you only give him roots. And when those roots take hold, they have the power to tear down towers. A cornered predator is infinitely more dangerous than a hunting one. I knew Anthony Beaumont wouldn't just sit in his high-security federal holding cell and quietly accept his demise. Men who have spent their entire lives manipulating the world from glass towers do not simply surrender to the concrete reality of a prison cell. By the spring of the following year, Genesis Agritech was not just a company, it was a global phenomenon. We had secured the domestic food supply, and our international outreach was expanding daily, but the shadow of biogenetics still lingered. The trial was approaching, and the discovery phase had revealed something deeply unsettling. Victoria and I were poring over the encrypted financial ledgers recovered by the Department of Justice. We sat in the newly constructed, hyper-secure conference room of our Vermont facility. The rain was lashing against the reinforced glass windows, a dark, stormy night that perfectly matched the tension in the room. "Look at this routing number," Victoria said, her finger tracing a line of digital transactions on the glowing monitor. Anthony's personal accounts were frozen, but 48 hours before the federal raid, a massive sum was wired from a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands to an untraceable private security firm based out of Eastern Europe. $2 million. I leaned in, my eyes narrowing. He didn't pay for high-priced defense attorneys with that. That's off-the-books money. Blood money. Exactly, Victoria murmured, her voice tight. The feds caught Derek Voss and the rest of the executive board, but Anthony always had contingency plans. The institutional investors like BlackRock and Vanguard didn't just dump his stock. Larry Fink himself reportedly ordered the immediate divestment of all biogenetics assets the moment the Texas crisis hit. Anthony lost his empire, his reputation, and his freedom in less than a week. He has nothing left to lose. A chilling realization washed over me. He's not trying to win the trial. He's trying to burn us down with him. We didn't have to wait long to find out how. 3 nights later, the alarms at Oak Haven didn't sound. That was the first indicator that we were dealing with elite, privately funded operators. The perimeter motion sensors, the thermal imaging cameras, the biometric locks, all of them were systematically bypassed with terrifying precision. I was awake, staring at the ceiling of the farmhouse bedroom, when my encrypted terminal silently flashed a single, pulsing red warning on the nightstand. A microscopic breach in the pressure seal of the secondary greenhouse. I gently nudged Victoria awake. She saw the flashing light, and all the sleep instantly vanished from her eyes. She didn't panic. She just nodded, slipping out of bed and moving toward the reinforced steel safe in the closet. We had known a physical strike was a possibility. When you hold the monopoly on the global food supply, you become a target. But I am a geneticist, not a soldier. I don't fight with bullets. I fight with biology. Through the internal hardwired closed-circuit feed that operated independently of our main network, we watched 3 figures clad in advanced, light-absorbing tactical gear slip into the secondary greenhouse. They moved with absolute silence, their night vision goggles glowing like demonic eyes in the dark. They bypassed the internal locks and moved straight toward the incubation pods, extracting the seed vials with practiced efficiency. They thought they were stealing the true Aegis master strain. They thought they were taking the very foundation of Genesis Agritech to sell on the black market or destroy, just as Anthony had commanded from his cell. They were wrong. "Trigger it," I whispered, my voice cold and steady. Victoria pressed a sequence of buttons on the secure terminal. Inside the secondary greenhouse, the overhead ventilation system engaged with a soft hiss. The intruders froze, realizing something had changed, but it was too late. The microscopic mist deployed from the ceiling wasn't a lethal gas. It was a synthetic, hyper-concentrated luminescent protein tracer that I had engineered specifically for this scenario. It bonded instantly to human keratin and synthetic fabrics at a molecular level. To the naked eye, the mist was invisible, but under ultraviolet light, it burned brighter than a flare. The intruders grabbed the decoy vials, which contained a completely inert, non-viable strain of common ryegrass, and slipped back out into the night, disappearing into the tree line, utterly unaware that they had just been permanently painted. I picked up the secure direct line to Agent Tanner. "Tanner," I said, watching the feed as the ghosts vanished into the woods. "Anthony's mercenaries just hit the decoy facility. They are currently moving south through the Appalachian Trail corridor. Tell your perimeter teams to switch on their UV optics. The targets will be glowing like deep-sea jellyfish. And Tanner, tell the DOJ to add corporate espionage and attempted biological theft to Anthony Beaumont's indictment." We watched the infrared satellite feed from Tanner's command center as the federal tactical teams closed in. The mercenaries, completely stripped of their stealth advantage, were apprehended within 20 minutes. They didn't even put up a fight. Anthony's final desperate strike had completely collapsed. He had tried to play God one last time, and I had used the very science he despised to trap him in the dark. The following winter, the trial concluded. Anthony Beaumont was sentenced to consecutive life terms in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely devoid of the luxuries he once considered his birthright. The judge cited his actions as one of the most egregious cases of corporate-driven ecological terrorism in modern history. With biogenetics officially erased from the earth, Genesis Agritech stepped into the light as the undisputed vanguard of the new agricultural revolution. But Victoria and I remembered the arrogance that had birthed the crisis. We refused to let Genesis become a monopoly. We open-sourced the base genome of the true Aegis, implementing strict, unbreakable licensing agreements that prevented any single corporate entity from patenting the modifications. To ensure the survival of the strain against any future cataclysm, we made a pilgrimage to the edge of the world. The icy winds of Spitsbergen, Norway, howled against the heavy winter coats we wore as we stood before the brutalist concrete entrance of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. It jutted out of the frozen mountain like a monolith, a silent guardian of human history. Inside this frozen vault, deep within the permafrost, lay the genetic backup of the planet's agriculture. I held a vacuum-sealed titanium case containing 10,000 pure true Aegis seeds. The facility manager, a stoic Norwegian scientist, guided us through the massive blast doors and down the long, illuminated tunnel into the heart of the mountain. The temperature dropped to a bone-chilling -18 degrees Celsius. Norman Borlaug once said that you can't build a peaceful world on empty stomachs and human misery, the manager said softly, referencing the legendary father of the Green Revolution as he opened the designated storage shelf. Your contribution today ensures that, quote, remains a reality, Mr. Miller. You have done a great service to the future. I placed the titanium case onto the metal rack. It sat among thousands of other crates from every nation on Earth. As I looked at it, I felt a profound sense of closure. The seeds were no longer just mine. They belonged to humanity. The ego that had once driven my ambition in the sterile labs of biogenetics was entirely gone, replaced by the quiet, enduring strength of the soil. Victoria slipped her gloved hand into mine, her shoulder pressing against me for warmth. "It's safe now," she whispered, her breath turning to frost in the freezing air. "It's finally over." But there was one last loose end to tie. When we returned to the United States, I was called to a deposition office in downtown Boston to finalize the liquidation of the remaining biogenetics physical assets. It was a formality, signing over the deeds of their abandoned warehouses to the city for redevelopment. As I walked out of the towering glass building, pulling my coat tight against the biting wind, a voice called out from the shadows of an alleyway, "John, please." I stopped. Stepping out of the gloom was Clara Jenkins. The sight of her was jarring, the impeccably tailored designer suits and the aura of untouchable arrogance were gone. She looked frail, her face lined with an exhaustion that makeup could no longer hide. She was wearing a cheap, fraying coat, and her hands were trembling violently in the cold. After offering to testify against Anthony, the DOJ had granted her a heavily restricted plea deal. She avoided prison, but she was stripped of all her credentials, her wealth, and her dignity. She was permanently blacklisted from the scientific community. "Clara," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of anger or pity. "I read about Svalbard," she stammered, stepping closer, her eyes wide and pleading. "I saw the broadcast. It's brilliant, John. The true Aegis. It's a masterpiece. You saved everyone." "Victoria and I saved everyone," I corrected her coldly. "What do you want, Clara?" Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over her pale cheeks. "I have nothing, John. The legal fees took everything. I'm working as a data entry clerk for a shipping logistics company. Me, a lead visionary biologist. I made a mistake. I was blinded by Anthony, by the pressure, but I know the science. I can still contribute. Please, just give me a chance at Genesis. Even as a lab assistant, I just want to be part of it again." She reached out, trying to grab my sleeve. I took a slow, deliberate step back. In my past life, the naive man who loved her might have felt a shred of mercy. He might have believed her tears, but I remembered the metallic taste of the poisoned coffee. I remembered the cold, calculating look in her eyes as she watched me die on the linoleum floor. She wasn't sorry for what she did, she was only sorry that she had lost. "A farm requires healthy soil to thrive, Clara," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "If you plant a diseased seed, it will eventually rot the entire harvest from the inside out. You are a diseased seed. You chose your harvest the day you handed Anthony that flash drive." "John, please, you can't just leave me like this. We were supposed to get married," she sobbed, desperation cracking her voice into a pathetic wail. "The man who asked you to marry him died a long time ago," I replied, turning my back on her. "Do not ever approach me again." I walked away, the sound of her crying fading into the ambient noise of the bustling city traffic. I didn't look back. There was nothing left in the past worth looking at. I climbed into the waiting car where Victoria was sitting, reviewing a holographic projection of our new soil reclamation initiative in sub-Saharan Africa. She looked up and smiled, a bright, genuine warmth that chased away the lingering chill of the Boston winter. "Everything finalized?" she asked. "Everything," I said, taking her hand as the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the ghosts of biogenetics in the rearview mirror forever. "Let's go home. We have a lot of planting to do." The journey from a sterile, corporate laboratory to the untamed, unforgiving earth taught me the most brutal and beautiful lessons of existence. The world is heavily populated by those who wish to extract, exploit, and steal the fruits of genuine labor. They will smile at you while holding a poisoned cup, but the soil is an honest judge. It does not respond to corporate manipulation, marketing campaigns, or stolen data. It only rewards patience, resilience, and absolute truth. We built an empire not by destroying our enemies, but by outgrowing them, letting their own greed choke them out like weeds in a vibrant field.